Royce and all pound, welcome back, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce an old friend and one of the classic Hay-on-Wye booksellers, who's, I will give him his correct title, Prince Derek Booth Addyman, heir to the Hay-on-Wye kingdom. And Derek owns 3 bookstores with his partner and Brickto in Hay, Addyman Books, Addyman Annexe, and Mayhem, Murder and Mayhem.
Death and Destruction.
Yes, and 2 of them are on the street where he was born, I believe.
Yes, that is
so
correct.
Derek has been around Hay for quite a while, and he's gonna talk to him a little bit about Hay-on-Wye, about book selling in general. So just to take us back to the beginnings.
Right. Where do you want to start?
You started working with Richard Booth.
Yes, yeah. Right. Well, how far shall I go back? As Evan said, I'm born and bred in Hay, 1955, and so growing up in Hay was in those years it's an agricultural town. The only real book shop besides, well, there's the library, but the only other shop that really sold any books were newsagents called Grants. And in fact, they'd been there since the 19th century, and they'd been printers, and they'd published pamphlets and small books over the years. I don't know when the last one they actually printed was. And so growing up in the formative years, and in about the early 1960s, this person called Richard Booth, who I knew nothing about at the time, except he was quite eccentric. And of course, one of his first bookshops that he opened up was the old cinema. And in fact, the last film that they showed at the cinema was Summer Holidays with Cliff Richard. And funny enough, I started watching a bit of it on Netflix the other night, and I just went, oh dear, I'm glad I didn't actually go and watch the film. I was too young anyway. So this guy, Richard Booth, well, what can one say, except he's the man who created a book town out of a town that didn't have any bookshops. And he was a man who had great foresight. It's difficult to explain about Richard, but in fact, there are a few things over the years that he said that at the time people thought he was absolutely crazy. But in fact, when you look around today, it's been proven right. Anyway, this is about books, but I think it's more than books because it's about a town that evolved from being a border agricultural town that was slightly, I suppose, dying on its feet. And in 1962, I think it was 62, 63, he actually bought a building which used to be the old fire station. And in fact, it's still got the old fire pit, the old pit where you used to look under the vehicles, still there. And anyway, he opened up an antique shop and threw a few books in. And he came to realize, because he'd been a great book buyer from the southeast of England, and his father used to take him into bookshops all the time. And so he kind of had this idea, well, antique books, why not just open a bookshop? And that's what he did. So he filled the old fire station with books. Then over the intervening years, properties were very, very cheap in Hay. So he bought them and filled them with books. And this is what he did with the cinema, which after it closed as a cinema, it was, I think, a discotheque for a short period, and also a bingo hall. And anyway, it was then decked out with a metal structure called Dexian shelving. Richard at that time found that books were actually quite easily available from mainly universities, publishers going out of business, and a lot of academics from the 20s or 30s all dying with huge libraries that nobody knew what to do. And also Richard, through his connections, and also a certain amount of money, which came from his Yardley stroke Booth Gin family, he was able to buy up libraries. And so that's really what started Hay on its journey. I think you could call it a journey. And also with Richard doing that, later on, jumping forward, I'm going to jump forward and backwards quite a bit because it all becomes connected at some point. He just was quite amazing of what he saw. I mean, some of it he made up as he went along, but obviously he had a vision of some kind. And that vision was, well, I've got one bookshop, why not fill a town full of bookshops? And by the end of the 1980s, 90s, there were a good 30 properties in Hay that had bookshops in. But with the advent of the internet, of course, footfall went down, numbers of bookshops decreased. But he managed, I think, instilled the idea into visits from all four corners of the earth who came to Hay and saw what Hay was doing with bookshops, that it could be replicated around the world. And what better man to have than not Obi-Wan Kenobi, but Richard Booth. I mean, this guy just had a vision, and his vision then kind of just bang, 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 was turning up, as I said, around the world. Now, my introduction to books was, as Evan said, I was born and bred in Hay. And I actually failed my 11 plus, but my mother was of this opinion that I should really go to grammar school like my brother. Well, when I was in the SecMod, I was always top of the class. I thought, whoa, this is brilliant. And then I went to the grammar school and I realized this is awful. And this was a grammar school. And I went from being top to being very down at bottom. And I don't know whether it was, I never read much, believe it or not. I never picked up a book except when I was in school. I watched probably far too much television. And so I found that school was awful. It did nothing for me. So I left school with 2 O levels and I was unemployed. And I thought, what am I going to do? Luckily, my father, who worked for Richard Booth at the time, he was a carpenter, plumber, electrician, said, my son's left school and he's, hasn't got any work. What shall you do? So they employed me. 3 months I lasted. That was my first sojourn with Richard, simply because he only paid me £4 a week. And that was for a 40-hour week. Talk about low wage. And anyway, over the intervening years from 1972 to 1976, I moved away for 12 months. But I worked with my father on building. And after I moved away and came back, again, I was unemployed, thinking, what am I going to do? Lo and behold, my dad said, why don't you ask Richard for a job? So I thought, okay. So that was in the summer of 1976. In fact, it was the February of 1976. Similar to a very hot year as we just had, 2022. And the introduction into bookselling was not what I expected. I thought it was going to be very genteel, relaxed, and, just, sort books. I mean, and in fact, Richard then had bought 7 container loads of books, of cheap books from America. Now, it was an incredible introduction into bookselling, that there were 750,000 books, of which most of them were rubbish. They really were. But, oh well, it was an introduction, unloading these books out of containers that by 9 o'clock in the morning you could fry your breakfast on the roof. It was incredibly hard work. But there we are, that's bookselling. And in fact, the first 6 to 9 months of bookselling with Richard was spent in the cinema bookshop. And the first job I had, move those books upstairs, and the ones that are upstairs, I want you moving downstairs. So I did it. And then about a month later, and this is absolutely true, right, well, those books you brought downstairs, I want you to move them all back upstairs, and the ones you moved down. So I thought, right, okay. And in fact, I found it a very good grounding, because bookselling is a back-breaking job, but a wonderful job. As I said, my education, lack of enthusiasm at school, because I think I must have had some of the most boring teachers who didn't inspire me one bit. But in fact, there was this thing, this book, which I just started picking up so much information. I mean, probably there's not much of it left now, but I just seemed to be right. And so I spent the next 12 months sorting books, and then I got the opportunity to price books. And it was, again, a very surreal experience, because Richard was a very surreal person. And he laid out a whole table. Well, actually, there were about 1,000 to 2,000 books. And he said, right, I want you to price all these books, and then I'm going to come back and check them. And I had no idea. I thought, wow, what am I doing? I mean, I'd sorted books out, seen what prices, looked at wonderful booksellers' catalogues from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And it was incredible reading those, because now, unfortunately, with the internet, as a well-known modern first dealer said, you have to describe books as though you're describing it to a 10-year-old child. Make it easy as possible so that they can understand. And anyway, going back to the catalogues that I read, they were incredible, because you read the descriptions of Bertram Rota, Francis Edwards, numerous booksellers, and some still around, some have gone into the distant past of bookselling, but they were so descriptive, and you could actually imagine the book in front of you. I didn't know what the books were, because you'd never seen them. I'd probably never see any of them, but they're wonderful descriptions. So it was a way, it was like my education was actually starting working in the bookshops. And I'm still not a great reader, although I do handle thousands and thousands of books a year. I started in working for Richard in 1976, and I'm still working in books in 2022. So that's like 46 years of bookselling, and I still enjoy it. I do get very tired. I get really, I don't know, dealing with people, answering questions, the same questions, day in, day out, year in, year out. It comes in different ways. I mean, I can't give you all the examples of what people ask for, but I'm looking for a green book. They do. They still do. I'm looking for a red book. It was a children's book. I can't remember the name of it. And it still happens. And you kind of don't throw your arms up into the air anymore. You just go, I'll Google it and see if I can find it. So you put red book, and of course that comes up. But you know, you're answering somebody's question, because not everybody's a fay with secondhand bookselling, because I think people still look at secondhand bookselling as, now it's a lot more liberal. There are a lot more women and transgender booksellers throughout the world, but it used to be just a very niche, oh God, middle-aged and 60s sitting behind a desk smoking their heads off. But of course, it's completely changed. Yeah, so it's a wonderful, wonderful profession, and I love what I do. And the wonderful thing is that about 20 or 25 years ago, I actually went to Teignmouth to buy. I was doing a bookselling buying trip around the southwest, and I visited a gentleman in Teignmouth, and he was actually 96. And he'd been in bookselling for over 60 years then. And I said, do you still enjoy it? He said, yes, because you never know what's going to turn up. And that's very true, even today, even with all the thousands and actually probably millions of books that I've actually handled, because I've worked in the Cinema Bookshop, which was at one time one of the largest bookshops in the world, and could hold about 300,000 books. I worked there for 6 years, so yeah, well, no, I worked there for longer than that, because I worked for the person who took it over. So yeah, I've handled quite a lot in my time, and it's just wonderful, really is.
First time I heard of Hay was in a New York Times full-page newspaper article about the independence of Hay and the largest bookstore. I was incensed, because I was 17 years old. My father's bookstore is the biggest in the world. So I came all the way to Hay to find out that no, the cinema had me beat.
Yeah, Richard went from small beginnings to a huge quantity of books, because he also had a house outside of Hay in a little place called Cusop. And these were, in fact, chicken sheds. They literally were the size of chicken sheds. And if you were a member of staff working up there, you felt like a chicken, you really did. But it did have the nickname of going to the gulag, because it wasn't heated and it was just full of books. That was the upside. The downside was it was cold. But these two amazing warehouses were full of, from 17th to 20th century literary periodicals. It was incredible. I mean, the half of one of them was just filled with Punch magazines. And I mean, there's English Illustrated, Strand, Argosy. I mean, the list was endless, and now you hardly ever see them. Where did they all go? Well, I know then where they were going. They were all going over to America. I mean, it was amazing the amount of books that Richard sold to the Americans. So all this literary collections were going over there, and Richard was going over there and buying all this remainder crap. It was unbelievable how it was working out. And I do know it because I worked through it. And also, I mean, God rest his soul, Richard. He taught me how to sell books and how not to sell books. You don't sell a book, you shouldn't sell a book that's not worth buying. There's a lot of, although Richard's philosophy was, and probably still is up to a point, that every book has a reader. Every book will have a buyer, even though it's been on the shelves for 10 or 15 years, and you think, right, well, that buyer has not turned up. But when you put them out at £1 each, it's surprising, it finds a buyer. So Richard's philosophy on that is true.
How did Hay, as a book town, succeed? And I can see where Richard was able to succeed, but you've got bookstores, there's lots of different books all competing with each other in a town.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the joy about Hay. It's not a very easy place to get to. Even worse now with the number of buses that come to Hay. But the lovely thing is that, all right, you have London, you have York, Bath. Those centres where at one point there were lots of bookshops, but now because of rents and rates, the numbers have actually dwindled quite a lot. I mean, I think the charm about Hay was, should I say the charm about Richard was, but no, the charm about Hay was, it's in the middle of Wales, a beautiful part of mid-Wales. It's got mountains, it's got rivers, it's what people read in books. It's like a dreamland, really. And because there were so many bookshops in Hay, I think that's why it succeeded. And also, Richard had the nous. He had this amazing vision, as I said, but also he was an amazing publicity machine, because Richard's publicity was all free. And probably one of the most amazing things that he did is when he declared Hay independent to the rest of Britain, or UDI, 1977. A lot of people thought he was mad, but all it took was one MP saying in the papers and in the House of Parliament, I don't think that they can do this. They can't declare UDI. Well, what else could you ask for? There's a member of Parliament saying Hay can't become independent. So that was it. I mean, that was the catalyst. So it just captured the imagination around the world. And still today, you do get people coming to Hay saying, oh, this is the independent town of Hay. Yes. And, you know, whether it's Indonesia, Fiji, New York, Paris, or Pembroke, you know, he just put it out there. And he did lots of publicity stunts like that over the years. And that's what I think gave the reason why people come to Hay. They kind of wanted to see what this town was about. And even today, I still ask people, especially from around the world, well, and it's their first visit, and you know, I ask them, even if they don't buy a book, I say, what have you enjoyed yourself? You know, what's your take on Hay? Have you enjoyed it? You know, and nobody said I've hated it. They've all said it's been a wonderful experience, whether they bought a book or they haven't. Hopefully, if they haven't bought this time, they'll come back in the future. And I think that's a kind of lovely concept. I mean, I know from working in books for such a long time in Hay, that there was a certain amount of jealousy around the country, in New York, in London, that how can this town that only gets second-rate books be so popular? Well, actually, we don't get second-rate books. It's surprising what gems have come into this town. And so that, you know, you kind of think, was this jealousy there because Richard had created something amazing from nothing? And it's just the way he did it, and the way it sparked imaginations in people's minds, not in this country, but from around the world. I mean, you still get people in this country saying, I didn't realize it was a town like this. I said, well, now you know, tell your friends. And occasionally Hay's out there, you know, I suppose banging its drum or banging its book, but you know, it's still here. And the dream, I think, I once said I've done quite a few interviews over the years, but I once said that they say all roads lead to Rome, while all booksellers lead to Hay-on-Wye, because of the bookshops. There aren't so many as there were, but it still has that sparkle and imagination about it.
You still able to find one? Yeah, big finds recently?
Funnily enough, I was talking to Evan about this. Yes. Yes, I've had lots. I mean, I can't pin them down. My partner Anne and I have been had our own. We started our own bookshop in 1987, which in bookselling terms isn't that long ago, but I suppose it is. So yes, we've bought some amazing things. We've kept some amazing volumes, and we've sold some amazing volumes. And but in fact, there are two that I did this year, and one of them was a collection of books on India, of which I know very little about. But they had belonged to a professor who worked at SOAS, and he died last year, aged 103. And there was just this amazing collection of books on India. A lot of the older ones, unfortunately, have got insect problems. But well, you know, that goes with, we're, you know, coming from a hot country, and it's not normal bookworm. It's like zit, 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 like a dart's gone through. And in fact, that relates to another book I did about 5 to 10 years ago. The timescale always escapes me. And I bought a collection of books in North Wales. And the executors said, oh, we've got 1,000 books on Buddhism and Eastern religions. Would you be interested? And I thought, oh, it's nothing we've handled before, so I'd go and have a look. Anyway, the 1,000 books, in fact, turned out to be 2,500 books. And they had been a collection of a lady called Margaret Stutley. And she was a leading authority on Buddhism and Hinduism. I was still writing for the Asiatic Society in her 90s. And I just couldn't believe it. And anyway, as a result of that particular buy, I've got dust on my lungs, and I've suffered ever since. But 2,500 books, and at least 90% of the books that I priced all had notes in pencil, not in pen, but in pencil by this Margaret Stutley. And I thought, that's incredible. So you think of people who write books on that, you know, she only wrote about half a dozen, but obviously authors, they get a book and either they're going to write notes, but this lady had written 95% of her books all had notes in. And that I thought was, again, just, you know, and she bought books from the age of 18 until she was 94, 95. So, you know, that kind of, you know, great book collectors. I mean, a writer, but a great book collector. And then probably, in fact, my favorite in over 40 odd years, this year, I did a very small book buy in a place called Cwntaleiri, which is part of Abertaleiri in South Wales. And I turned up at this guy's house, and he had a surname Taylor. I'm afraid I can't remember his first name. Anyway, I turned up, and he just had a general collection of books, poetry, some Welsh travel, etc. And he came to the door, and his body was slightly broken, and he said, I'm sorry, I suffer with arthritis a lot, because I used to do mountaineering, and I've fallen a few times, and it's never healed properly. So I said, fine. So I came in, and I started looking at his books and thinking, oh, there's some reasonable stuff. And we just generally got talking, and I said, what do you read? And, you know, have you written any books? He said, no, but my brother's written a book, written 1 or 2 books. And I said, oh, right. Yeah, Derek Taylor. And there's only one Derek Taylor that I ever could put my name to, and he was the publicist for the Beatles. So this guy in Cumtulary was a brother of Derek Taylor, publicist for the Beatles in the 1960s. Books were out of the window. Finding out about the Beatles, to me, was more important because that's something I grew up with and I really enjoyed. And that was I don't know, it was the loveliest 2 hours I ever spent in buying books in all my years. And I'll never forget it because there's a couple of things about, I can't really relate the stories because of the language involved, but it was just a joy, one of the joys of bookselling.
Before you arrived, the conversation was talking about books and book history, and they were saying it is about people. It's very much about the people who you meet and who buy the books and who wrote the books and who mark up the books. It really is what it is. The connections there are really vital to make it happen, make it worth doing.
Yes, it is. I mean, yes, talking to the people who you're buying the books from and finding out where they came from and the connections, and it's hard to describe. It's nothing I can really put into words. It's a special feeling that a lot of people say books are their friends. And when they come to actually sell their friends, it's a really hard job. And it brings a lump to my throat when I'm there, and whether it's their books or it belongs to a family member. And they said, we're selling old friends. And I said, I absolutely understand, because those old friends, those books have obviously shaped their lives in one way or another. About 2 years ago, it's definitely after the pandemic, a young lady came into the shop and she said to me, she said, "What book has changed your life?" And I said, "They all have." And she said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "They've all changed my life, but isn't there one particular book?" And I said, "No, they have all changed my life, not just from the sake of buying and selling, which is up there, but also the content." As I said, I hated school, but the contents of these books have made it all really, really worthwhile.
On that note, I think we need to finish off. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Good health.
And we've been left. Right. Okay. And everyone online, we'll see you tomorrow. We start at 9. Sorry, 9:15 tomorrow morning. So
Bye-bye.
to wake up, have some coffee. Bye now.
Sorry. To tell you the truth, I can't remember. I have people coming into the shop who said, "Oh, you bought books off us about 20 years ago." And you think, am I supposed to remember you? Well, thank you. I do enjoy talking about it. I try not to waffle, but it's, as far as timeline goes, you have